kiln it. And so that kilning process is what halts at germination. And from there, the kilning, where I mentioned a lot of the variation in malted barley is a result of process. So that process is kilning or roasting. The combination of those two, so that creates all of your different types of malted barley, to where you might have one that is very pale, or you may have one that is kind of medium dark, or you may have one that is very dark. And all of those varieties come from that kilning and or roasting process. And then, I think most of the other ones we covered to a degree. Talked about conditioning and lagering. From there,
conditioning and lagering the interchangeable terms.
well, so it's kind of like squares and rectangles. So lagering is conditioning, but conditioning is not necessarily lagering. So I would refer to lagering as, it typically refers to an extended period that's necessary for a lager yeast to do its job. So conditioning, while there is some fermentation finishing up, the yeast is kind of doing the last bit of its job. Part of that conditioning process is cooling it down to where that yeast can crash out, they say, or we talked a little bit about finings in the last class with Steve, to where those finings will be added to help those yeasts or proteins or whatever particulate matter crash out of the beer. So the cold temperatures helps that happen, and so that's kind of the primary objective of that conditioning phase. And then lagering is kind of like a next step after that. But it can all be looked at as the same thing, just compartmentalized into different usages.
So it's post-fermentation, you're basically letting the yeast die off and blast.
Well, so I guess lagering is different in that with the lager yeast, it likes those conditions. It likes working in those conditions, and that's what creates the really clean, approachable, not fruity, not weird profiles. Is that operating in the colder conditions allow that it metabolizes those fermentable sugars a lot slower, and it doesn't put off nearly as many byproducts as a result. So getting into tasting and flavors and things like that, esters, so like fruity characteristics that come from yeast production. Yeast produce those. Those are not going to happen, or in most lagers, those are not going to happen because those yeast are not acting in a way that's going to. The lager yeast just don't produce them, or most styles you don't want them to produce them. So having that long, cold, extended lagering process is essential for that yeast to get its job done. So it takes longer. It's like, when it's cold, things just take longer. So, hopefully that clarifies a little bit. And that'll, we do have a class on yeast led by Michael Pearson, so I think they'll have all the details you guys could ever ask for about fermentation. I guarantee it. And then, again, we touched on it a little bit in the last one, but filtration and packaging. So that one, everybody does it a little bit differently. So thinking back to those finings, that way of clarifying the beer, some people use those. Some people are using filters. Some people are using centrifuges. But ultimately, for whatever freaking reason, it's desirable to have your beer clear. And in most cases, it's also beneficial. It can create, a more stable product, not having all these proteins and things floating around in your beer. So that filtration or fining process is going to happen to some degree. But like I said, when you're in conditioning, that's going to cold crash a lot of those things out of the beer, kind of by natural processes. And then packaging. So, looking way, way, way back to the beginnings of beer, you know, we saw first evidence of beer, although quite different from what we think of as beer today, coming about around 10,000 BC. And then, so we had, at that time, Neolithic people, they're growing their ingredients. You know, think about, they're not going to great fermentations and buying Crystal 40 malt. They've got to find it somewhere out in, you know, in their environment. And so they didn't magically walk over and find a huge barley stock and were like, oh, let's start, you know, brewing beer with that. It kind of started out more as like simple grasses and things, where throughout their agricultural practices over the years, they would keep the best seeds and save those for the next season and keep doing that. And I'm sure over a long period of time, eventually that stuff kind of turned into to barley and wheat and other grains, evolved into those grains that we now know today. That's a gross oversimplification of how that actually happened, but just know that early on they were not brewing with chocolate malt and, you know, all these other fancy flake oats and whatnot. So then, projecting forward a little bit farther, more to like the 3000 BC time frame. So by that point, you know, people were consuming beer, people were also consuming wine. They both kind of really came about around the same time. At the time, I'm sure this kind of set the stage for today's world, but wine was mainly consumed by the royalty, and everybody drank beer. I'm sure royalty did, you know, like everybody. It was a very common thing. And so then beer was well established. There should be a nice little ED on that typo. By 3000 BC. So by now the Egyptians are brewing beer, and it was said that, you know, that was essentially what fueled the construction of the pyramids. By this time, beer is used as sustenance, and so people were consuming this stuff kind of as they work. I'm sure it was pretty sketchy while they're building some pyramids, but they got it done. So, you know, and then moving forward again, prior to the year 1000, all beer, they didn't have hops at that time. So the Egyptians, all the early dudes that are brewing, they're brewing what eventually became known as Brewit, to where in place of hops, they're using like spices and herbs and weird things like bog myrtle and all this weird stuff. And then around this time, year 1000, people came across hops and began, you know, exploring the kind of properties that brought to beer, and going into Germany, or looking forward to Germany. Germany was really the first to embrace hops from a brewing perspective and start utilizing those on a more regular basis. And then eventually that beer started spreading. I mean, it's kind of like, it's interesting to look back at it because it's really reflective of what we're seeing today. For whatever reason, people like hops in beer. Really the underlying principle is hops bring balance to the beer. So whatever you have, when you have that, you know, the wort that's coming from malted barley and being fermented, if you had no hops in it, that would be really, really sweet. It would be very sweet. And so hops bringing that bitterness allow the finished product to be balanced. So I'm sure that this newfound hop beer in Germany was, you know, way more balanced than what people saw up to that point. So they started exporting it, of course, made its way into Amsterdam, and then people started producing it in Amsterdam. And from there, it caught on and was exported down to the Flanders region, and you know, by then it was sort of taking over that people were utilizing hops in their beer. And So then, around the year 1500, we had some people immigrate to England from Flanders. So some Flemish immigrants went over and brought this hoppy beer, well, beer with hops. It wasn't really hoppy at the time. And so then that caught on in England. And so in England, it eventually became known as porter. So the first beers that were brewed there were called porter because it was widely consumed by people who were porters, essentially dudes that would carry big, heavy things around. That's what a porter did, and so they would drink a lot of beer. I think it was, I don't know if I had it on here, but farther down the line in like the 1800s, they were consuming like 1.2 million barrels of porter. Like they were drinking a lot of it.
Next one.
Yeah. So England, kind of tying into how the beers were evolving. They had this brown malt that was really widely available in England at the time. Interestingly enough, that brown malt is not so available these days. So if you have people who are purists that want to brew like a brown ale or brown porter, really true style, they'll really emphasize the character that comes from this brown malt. But as far as between the 17th century time and into the 19th, 20th century, that brown malt kind of became a thing of the past. But it was widely available at the time, so it was the base malt for what was known as porter. And being brown malt, obviously you would guess that it's going to be darker than what you think of as like even English beers today or German beers or whatever. So the common beers that people were drinking were fairly dark, and that's why that porter eventually evolved into what we now know as porter, kind of a dark, chocolatey, slightly roasty step on its way to stout. Although at the time they were becoming more and more hoppy. And so they kind of followed this trend of brewing with more and more hops. People liked it, and eventually, as they discovered other malts and kept experimenting with hops, it kind of sparked the beginning of pale ale. So again, kind of an overview, but here's some of the styles that we have coming from England. These are modern day styles that would come off of the BJCP guidelines, but I think what most people think of, what I think of when I think of English beers, are right up here. Pale ales, bitters. So when people talk about bitters, they're talking about an ordinary bitter, best bitter, ESB, extra special bitter. At the time when they came about, they were more hop forward and more bitter, but as you compare to IPA, English IPA, especially American IPA, bitters are not bitter. They're not like an IPA. Think of it like a pale ale, kind of like this category calls it. And they're very low in strength. So an ordinary bitter could be as low as like, I don't know what the guidelines say, they're like 2.5–3%. So that's kind of what people are crushing on when you go over to England today and you drink off of the cask at one of the pubs. You're drinking some bitters.
Post ESB?
Yeah. Do that. You talk about pork. Yeah, so we can fire that up. While you're doing that, I'm gonna eat this taco. Getting hungry. The chicken one was actually pretty good. No shit.